In our last episode, we walked through a lot of incredibly complicated themes and ideas regarding the actual military conflict of the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, leading up until what we're going to talk about today, which is the response to that bloodshed. Hi, Sam.
Hi, Logan. Beautiful introduction there.
Yeah. This has been really tough to talk about.
Incredibly.
It's not easy to talk about this.
No, and it's part of the reason that it hasn't been talked about. It's part of the reason that, Logan, you and I are both raised in Minnesota. If something's uncomfortable and something's unpleasant, you don't talk about it. When that sometimes is steeped into decades of historiography, that can lead to not the most accurate or deeply fleshed out telling of the events. But Mary Lethert Wingerd has written a wonderful book called North Country, which does go into detail, presents a very balanced and fact-based telling of these stories. But it doesn't do that at the expense of good writing. So we are in the middle of chapter 11 called Cataclysm on the Minnesota. And we are on page 312, and I quote Wingerd. While the hostiles were engaged in fighting, the friendly Indians used the time to transfer nearly all the captives to their camp. Over the next 4 days, as they impatiently waited for Sibley's forces to arrive, the camp's population steadily grew. By the time the troops marched in, it had become a small city of 150 lodges. Only about 200 warriors followed Little Crow onto the plains, which seemed alien and forbidding to the woodland Mdewakanton and Wapakutes. Many more, relying on Sibley's word, chose to surrender rather than exodus. Mixed-blood prisoner Samuel Brown dryly noted a new spirit of fellowship that sprang up in the camp. Quote, all were friendly to the whites and anxious to shake hands with Sibley and the others who had so recently been sworn their enemies. One Indian, to emphasize his loyalty, quote, wrapped the American flag around his body and mounted his horse and sat upon him in full view of the troops that passed by, end quote. So what is being put together here will eventually be called Camp Release. And this is where the peace party, the friendly Indians, as Wingerd calls them, are assembling not just the captives, the warring Dakota who will now essentially stand trial, but also the peaceful Indians that were displaced, and also some victims from the war are at Camp Release. And it's like Samuel Brown's talking about there, a very distinct culture and energy, and
Right.
Obviously it's not all positive. The goal here is to ostensibly to create some sort of justice, to prosecute and make peace. And Sibley makes the claim that only those who had directly murdered whites will be either hanged or prosecuted. So that's what encourages a lot of the war party to actually turn themselves over rather than run away with Little Crow and the rest of the war party.
Right. Wingerd makes the really excellent. Well, she doesn't originally make the point, but she highlights a quote from one person who very wisely says that if anyone believed he was guilty of killing a white man, he would have fled with Little Crow. Everyone who was being tried by Sibley was there of his own accord, believing that this was the proper avenue towards peace and that they were innocent of having done anything wrong during the conflict. Sibley trapped people into this camp, but they had come to the area on his promises that they would be treated well. But when he commissions a group of 5 men to administer trials under a military commission, he doubts whether he has the authority to do so, first of all, but goes forward with it and makes it clear very quickly as the trials begin and as he orders them to continue at a rapid pace, that he is not looking to keep his word.
Right. So I quote Wingerd again. At the end of 2 weeks, when the camp, now christened Camp Release, had swelled to about 2,000 Indians, Sibley sprang the trap. His men surrounded the camp, taking all the Indians into custody, including those who had vigorously opposed the war, saved many whites, and protected the prisoners throughout their ordeal. The soldiers arrested 400 men, clapped them in irons, and soon brought them before what could only be termed a kangaroo court to determine their fate, end quote. And kangaroo court's a good term only because there isn't another good term for a total sham. The only reason I don't like the term kangaroo court is it sounds funny. Okay, I guess I have multiple reasons. But also, it has the word court in it, which this wasn't. They didn't actually have the military authority to have a military court, and they did not have any of the legal setup. They didn't have the people that they needed. They didn't follow the rights of the accused. They didn't do. It wasn't a valid military court, and it wasn't a valid civilian court. And despite that, 303 individuals were sentenced to death. And some trials lasted only 5 minutes or less, and some were convicted because they confessed to picking radishes in the woods, or turnips, I think they were. Sorry, I don't want to be sued for misquoting the kangaroo court. He took a few turnips at the big woods, and it was unclear whether they were convicting people because they held a gun at a battle, whether they fired a gun at a battle. Was it just for killing? Was it for, like we talked about last week, sexual assault or rape? Was it for any of these things? And truthfully, it didn't matter. The commission was dead set on convicting as many Dakota as possible because they wanted to kill and execute as many Dakota as possible, regardless of their guilty status.
Yes. So the 5 minute figure is pretty famous. The 5 trials were 5 minutes. Sometimes.
Famous 5 minute figure is also
famous 5 minute figure.
That's was almost Jimmy John's tagline.
There you go. That's right.
Yeah.
I think I heard that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
okay, there are so few opportunities for humor when we're talking about this. I'm really
you
grasping.
had to go for it.
Minutes,
you had to
time.
Go for it.
That's impartial. I can make a joke about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
It's not a laughing matter.
No, it's not. So how does it happen that a trial is 5 minutes? Well, first of all, a Dakota man. Let's imagine the situation. A Dakota man is told he's to come and talk to Sibley's men.
In a language most likely told to him in broken Dakota or English that he isn't fully equipped with.
Yes. As he walks into the room, he has never been told that he's on trial. He's never been told that he's been accused of anything. He's never been told that he's been charged with any crimes. He walks into the room and a group of men are there. They ask him in English if he has been, let's say, whether he was at Birch Coulee, one of the battles of the war, whether he was at Birch Coulee. And,
present.
Present. And translator would translate it for him. He'd be like, oh, yeah, I was present. And if he felt defensive about it, he might say, I was forced into it, I felt pressured into doing whatever. But for a majority of them, they're just like, oh, yeah, I'll tell the truth. Yeah, I was around. Yeah, I was there.
Because a lot of them were told that unless you killed anyone, you're fine.
Yep. So they have no reason not to say that. So yeah, okay. And then they say, all right, talk to you later. And he leaves, and they sentence him to death. They don't inform him that he's been sentenced to death. They don't inform him that he's been proven guilty in a court of law. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of the legal work that's going on is completely hidden from the actual people being prosecuted.
Right. And even if they believed that everyone who said they didn't kill anyone was lying, even if they believed that everyone was lying, they still lied to them. They still deceived them. The defendants were given no rights in the standards of military or civil court. and it is a sham, and that's where I hesitate to call it a court or a trial or anything like that. It is ridiculous. There's a book available, I believe, at
Yeah.
which county is it?
Ooh.
There's a
feel
book
like
out there. There's a book out
Yeah.
there. I believe it is at the Traverse des Sioux historical site. I believe, where they have the transcripts of all the trials. And I'm not going to say you should read it for fun. It's not fun, but it's everything. It's all of it, and it's pretty awful. It's awful. First person accounts of the U.S. Dakota War are extremely personal and extremely complicated, and there's also several layers of, was this recorded properly? Was this translated properly? Was this told properly? There are so many layers that it's so hard to get to the truth of the matter. So they say 303 folks are sentenced to death, 22 unspecified terms of imprisonment, and only 69 were acquitted, and only 8 actually released of all the folks of the 400 people who are arrested. And along the way, General Pope, you'll remember him. He's the one who also sucks at being a general, and
Yes.
wanted to prove himself. And he was in the genocidal camp, in case you're wondering. On the extreme of, do we exterminate or do we just genocide? He's the genocide. And along the way, he remembered, oh yeah, we need presidential approval to execute people. Whoops.
Halfway through the process,
Yes.
he realized that.
Yes. And so they send the 303 trials to Lincoln's office, and Wingerd writes, one cabinet member was, quote, disgusted by the trials, thought them, quote, discreditable, and went so far to suggest that the entire episode had been orchestrated to get title to Indian lands. The president, Lincoln, ordered a stay of all executions until he personally reviewed the trial transcripts. Sick at heart by the ongoing slaughter in the South, Lincoln had no appetite for mass hangings. He agreed with the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, William Dole, that such actions would be a, quote, stain on the national character. The president was also troubled by a recent meeting with Bishop Henry Whipple, who had eloquently laid out the history of abuses that finally culminated in violence. Lincoln was so moved that he pledged, quote, if we get through this war and I live, this Indian system shall be reformed, end quote. So Lincoln, as we'll find out, is responsible for the largest mass execution in United States history, against the Dakota 38. But in terms of adults in the room, he did decrease it by almost tenfold.
I want to say also, Wingerd doesn't bring this up, but it was a New York Times, I believe, front page scandal.
Right.
When the news of the trials came out, they were actually leaked from Pope's report. They were leaked to the press, I believe, to the New York Times or the New York Tribune.
Release Gate,
Pope
Sibley Gate,
whatever you want to call it. And it was a scandal because these were obviously fraudulent. And so all of these people today who defend these actions because that's just how people were back then. You know, that's how in the 1860s everyone was single-mindedly genocidal in this way. It's just not true.
It's a lie. It
is a lie. The people, first of all, you have people like Bishop Whipple who actively said the blame for this bloodshed lies on the United States government. And sure, he wasn't in the majority of Minnesotans, but he existed. It wasn't impossible for people to feel that way, to say those things. They had the ability to see the truth. Mm-hmm. And further, the actual trials themselves were widely regarded as a fraudulent sham. It was a huge scandal in the nationwide press. And one of the reasons why Lincoln had to reduce the number of men executed was because, certainly he and his cabinet found it morally reprehensible what had been done. there was also significant political pressure on Lincoln to act in a humane way, to the extent that he could.
Right.
And so Lincoln does the Lincoln thing, which is that he finds the political move, and the political move is to balance the demands of the white Minnesotans with the demands of Northerners and his conscience. And first, he says, we will only execute those who have been proven guilty of rape. We talked about this a lot last time, and only two. His lawyers only find 2 men out of the trials of 300 who could be credibly accused of rape.
So then they only executed 2 men, right, Logan?
Well, no, because Lincoln knew that this is where, again, this is where Lincoln has a moral failing in this process, and it's in his interests of being a politician. Is he has to do this? By the way, he absolutely from a political standpoint, he has to kill more of these Indians.
There's a
in order to retain the support of Minnesota.
There's a chance that an uprising, this time a white uprising, would take place in Minnesota.
Sure.
Where many more would be killed. And we'll talk about this later on, is they didn't wait for Lincoln's decision to attack innocent Dakota people. That's probably giving Lincoln too much credit there. But,
absolutely. Yeah. But, well, he had to do it politically. He didn't have to do it morally. You don't have to make the political decision. You know, like it's a defense of Lincoln that I see all the time, is that he had to do it politically, and he did. I think he did have to do it politically.
If you're a politician, you have to do it.
Yeah, and that's also why I think he would be okay with us saying that it was an immoral decision.
Right.
He knew it was. He understood that, and he decided actively that he was, the way I've thought about it for a while is that to him, especially in 1862, this is very early in the Civil War.
His son had just died.
Sure, his son had just died, and his single-minded focus is winning the Civil War at any cost. It's not yet about emancipating the slaves. It's not yet about a new birth of freedom. That will come later in his experiences with the trauma of the war and experiences with black activists. But right now, it's all about winning the war. And he's willing to sacrifice his morality. He's willing to sacrifice his personal moral virtue to and the lives of 38 Dakota in order to win the war. In his mind, because he believes that he needs the political support of Minnesotans.
Right.
So I don't think I think it's perfectly fair to morally discredit Lincoln on the grounds of this execution. He understood that it was an immoral choice, and he felt pressured to make it because of his circumstances. But I think it's totally reasonable to think about it in a moral framework. Right.
Speaking of white men who we want to give more credit to, let's talk a little bit about Bishop Whipple. Bishop Whipple, Henry Whipple, we've talked about him quite a bit. He's a Faribault figure, but he's also one of the most important men in early Minnesota history, largely because of his advocacy on behalf of indigenous people. And the reason I say we give too much credit to him is he also, as a missionary, his job was to evangelize. His job was to baptize as many indigenous people as possible. And his job was to likewise get rid of as much of the indigenous culture as he could, because that would make them, in his minds, better Christians. Where he does get more credit is he didn't believe that believing in the traditional Dakota way of life or spirituality was inherently, immoral or anything like that. And if a man was good in whatever he believed, we have evidence that he respected him and was fine with it. So being morally good for the time is not genocidal and okay with people thinking other things. So that's where we give him credit. But a lot of the reason we give him credit is because of the immense advocacy that he did and his general peacefulness, gentle nature, that sort of thing, that many missionaries of the time were simply missing. I quote Wingerd, "Only Henry Whipple proved willing to brave the inevitable backlash to publicly raise his voice on behalf of the Dakotas." And she's talking specifically about missionaries. As a consequence, in the words of one historian, he was the most unpopular man in Minnesota. Since his arrival 4 years earlier, the bishop had crusaded against the corruption of the Office of Indian Affairs and the injustices suffered by the state's native population. Following the outbreak, Whipple courageously published an article that sought to tamp down the bloodlust that was sweeping across the state. Quoting Whipple, "Who is guilty of the causes which desolated our border? At whose door is the blood of these innocent victims? I believe that God will hold the nation guilty." Back to Wingerd. "But people were in no mood to hear the litany of injustices that had driven the Indians to their desperate actions. Some even targeted the bishop with death threats for his words." End quote. So again, that's where he had quite a bit of advocacy and compassion when many, even men of the cloth, were missing that. Stephen Riggs, as we'll find out, pretty much admitted that well, the guys that are going to hang may not be the right ones, but we gotta get revenge somehow. So the souls will even out in the end. Those were his beliefs around the time, which is obviously absolutely disgusting.
So there's a really complicated, just in the same way that Dakota society is complicated and exists along a continuum of political beliefs. In the same way, I think today people can flatten the racism of the time and make it one-dimensional, where the racism of the 1860s was complicated, it was multidimensional, and it manifested in different kinds and different degrees of violence. Mm-hmm. And it's important to understand that it was resisted in different ways too. It was resisted by Dakota people, and it was resisted in feeble but real ways by people like Bishop Whipple. Mm-hmm. It was not a fully unified mass of white people versus a fully unified mass of Dakota people. Mm. There was nothing genetic differentiating Dakota people and white people that meant they had to kill each other.
Nor culturally inevitable.
Nope. And a lot of the historical accounts that make it seem culturally inevitable, I honestly think have their roots in thinking of it as being a genetic difference between these groups of people, that essentially being racist. These are just these. This
if you simplify
people.
It like that, Logan, then people will want to engage with it.
These are people, and like people today and at all times, they are complicated. They are real. They breathe air. They smile and laugh and get angry at things they shouldn't.
Keep going. And how do you describe a human being? For those of you who don't know, Logan comes from the planet Neptune.
That's right.
And
it's lovely this time of year. I recommend everyone comes.
Probably better than Minnesota right now. But hearing him describe human beings is always interesting. Speaking of human beings, there are thousands of them in 1862. Who are innocent, and so there's do you like my transition there? That's my segue.
All right, well done. Yeah, when Logan starts talking about what humans are. That's the time to let's head back to the book.
Okay, buddy. There are a lot of innocent Dakotas. So now, at the same time that most of the state, including the military and political leadership, are calling for the genocide of the Dakota people, they're also tasked with protecting the innocent Dakota people, because around this time, the federal government basically says, okay, all the treaties are moot, everyone's screwed, figured out.
The 1863 Dakota Exile Act.
Well,
is what you're...
Thank you, yeah. But the Dakota were not safe on their reservations at this point anymore. And right now they have 1,700 Dakotas in custody. And they are moving them to a camp below Fort Snelling. And this essentially turns into an internment camp. And in the past, Logan and I have called it a concentration camp because of the deaths that resulted there. And
we're not the first ones to say it, by the way. That
correct.
comes from Dakota people today. Some Dakota people today refer to it as a concentration camp.
Right. Yes. Good clarification on yes. So they need to move these hundreds of people from Camp Release to Fort Snelling. And there are 300 soldiers to protect the 4-mile-long wagon train along 150 miles, including, like, this isn't just like they're going through the back roads is what I wanted to call it, but all of Minnesota is back roads at this point.
Right.
They would be going through a lot of the communities that were filled with the fear of the war or who directly suffered during the war. There's going to be vengeance. There's going to be anger. There are horrific accounts of the attacks that took place, including the murder of a Dakota baby taken from her mother's arms. Samuel Brown is quoted as saying, "Men, women, and children armed with guns, knives, clubs, and stones rushed upon the Indians as the train was passing by, and before the soldiers could interfere and stop them, succeeded in pulling many of the old men and women and even children from the wagons by the hair of the head and beating them, and otherwise inflicting injury upon the helpless and miserable creatures." And there are just awful accounts of what was going on. And it didn't get much better once they arrived at Fort Snelling, because there just happened to be, was it measles?
It was a measles outbreak that swept through Minnesota. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. The winter of 1862 to 1863 was a brutal one. Most of the food that they got was rotten, or aged and hard and otherwise toxic to eat, essentially. And there are sketchy accounts of how much the soldiers at Fort Snelling were actually committed to protecting the Dakota people at the internment camp. It seems they would turn a blind eye to whites who wanted to go in and get their own personal vengeance for 1862. And as a result, hundreds of Dakota died in that camp. Meanwhile, the Dakota who eventually are whittled down to 38, who are to be executed, are eventually moved to Mankato, where they themselves also face the wrath of lynch mobs, along with hundreds of other Dakota who were no longer sentenced to be killed, but still sentenced to an unspecified prison term. So there were still hundreds of Dakota living in Minnesota under captivity, in bad conditions, in clothes that were, covered in bugs and gnats, and weren't obviously hygienic at all, chained to the floor, given horrible food to eat. There wasn't much of a distinction between those who were found guilty and those who had nothing to do with the fighting, in terms of their treatment from both the government and the white public. Eventually, Lincoln did make the announcement, and the execution date was set for December 26th, 1862. And that was the largest execution in United States history. The colonel who was put in charge in preparation for the hanging and in protecting the prisoners was Colonel Stephen Miller, and he declared martial law and banned the sale of consumption of alcohol in a 10-mile radius of Mankato. Wingerd writes, It was a wise precaution. Wagons began swarming into town on Christmas night, overflowing with men, women, and children eager to see the Indians get what they felt was coming to them. By the morning, the streets were packed and jammed with spectators, 4,000 people by some estimates. She continues later on. The condemned men painted their faces with streaks of vermilion and aquamarine, shook hands politely with the soldiers and reporters, and waited patiently for the appointed hour. At 10 o'clock precisely, they formed a procession to the scaffold, walking between columns of soldiers, quote, eagerly and cheerfully, even crowding and jostling each other to be ahead, end quote. A local journalist wrote in admiration, quote, no equal number ever approached the gallows with greater courage and more perfect determination to prove how little death can be feared. Some of the men even helped adjust the nooses around their neck. Then they commenced to sing a traditional death song, which in Dakota culture exalted the integrity of the person about to die and affirmed the meaning of his existence as an individual and as a member of the tribe. A few moments later, drum beats signaling the execution began. The men grasped one another's hands, calling out their names to each other as the floor of the scaffold dropped with a thud, and 38 bodies suddenly swung lifelessly from the gallows. The rope-throttling, rattling runner snapped, and his body fell to the ground. Though his neck was broken, the soldiers strung him up again, just to be dead. And so concluded the largest mass execution in American history. The crowd was surprisingly subdued. After a moment of hushed silence, they emitted just one loud, drawn-out cheer in approbation, then quietly began to disperse. Perhaps the unsettling juxtaposition of dignity and horror momentarily dampened the celebratory mood. For at least one young woman who was present that day, the memory made a lifelong impression. Quote, it was an awful spectacle for a girl of 15 to witness, Sarah Montgomery wrote many years later. The scene is as vivid to me now as it was more than 70 years ago, end quote. But many more who lost their homes or friends and family must have felt no regret in seeing any Indians, pay for their grievous losses. Few of the white victims knew or understood the long history that had led to this moment. They had been caught up in a conflict not of their making, one that touched everyone in the state. White Minnesotans of all ranks and ethnicities, farmers, businessmen, middle-class matrons, laborers, had suffered a collective trauma. Their sense of security was shattered. As the months ahead would demonstrate, the war against the Indians was by no means over, end quote. So after the execution, after the calendar year 1862 is done, we head into what might be the equally brutal year, if not more brutal for the Dakota people, 1863. And there are more atrocities in this chapter, Logan, than we can cover even in the two parts that we are discussing. And even Wingerd has a wonderful book. I was surprised about different parts that were glossed over that I know about in more detail, and parts that I had never heard of in excruciating detail. And it was, it can be difficult to read and to talk about this. One of the things that I hadn't ever heard of was the Knights of the Forest. Had you heard of this, Logan?
I think only on prior readings of this chapter. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. So real quickly, the Knights of the Forest were made up of, quote, the most prominent and influential men of Mankato and Blue Earth County. Wingerd writes, the Knights incorporated all the trappings of a typical fraternal order of the time, secret handshakes, passwords, and rituals, but their single-minded mission was to use every exertion and influence to cause the removal of all tribes of Indians from the state of Minnesota, end quote. So people using their normal citizen by day, vigilante by night, except both of them are committed to the same thing, and that is to get rid of as many Indians as possible. And it was about this time that, so their pledge duty was, quote, to lie in ambush and shoot any Indian who might be observed outside the lines of the reservation, because it was now illegal for an Indian to be outside their designated land. And Mankato, you'll remember, is right next to the Winnebago reservation, which is on beautiful farming land, which is surely only coincidental that the most prominent businessmen of the area would be interested in that land. And around this time, the state of Minnesota, I believe, also put together a compensation of $25 for the scalp of any Sioux delivered to the office, in addition to a citizen militia that they would put together. So this militia would be compensated based on the amount of scalps they would provide, evidence that they had killed an Indian. And if people were working independently outside of the scouts, they would be paid $75 for every bounty. Within weeks, Wingerd writes, citizens were out in force, chasing rumored sightings, determined to kill off the red rascals. But despite these Indian hunters' enthusiasm for the task, few Indians could be found, and they produced only 3 scalps over the course of the summer. Hoping for better results, the state raised the bounty several times. By fall, a scalp was worth $200, but by then most Dakotas had vanished from Minnesota. Absolutely disgusting. It is state-sanctioned genocide at every level, including in the concentration camp below Fort Snelling. So there are about 1,600 Dakotas there defined there over the winter. Wingerd writes, more than 200 Dakotas died over the winter, mainly children and old people, end quote. And at this time, there was a great conversion among the captive Dakota, whether they were guilty prisoners or those in a camp who did not commit any crime. Conversion to Christianity suddenly became very popular in a way that it hadn't been decades before. And that was because, some of them may have had a genuine spiritual awakening. But largely it is believed that these are the result of last-ditch effort assimilation. Your last attempt to prove that you are willing to live as the white man does. And like you said, Logan, 1863, they passed the Act for the Removal of the Sissetons, Wahpetons, Mdewakanton, and Wapakuta bands of Sioux or Dakota in the United States Senate. And so now they start moving them to different reservations outside of the state of Minnesota.
I want to bring back Thomas Galbraith to talk about that. Listeners of our previous episode will remember him as the horrible Indian agent whose administration directly precipitated the U.S. Dakota War. His solution to the war was, as Wingerd puts it, a well-guarded reservation in Dakota Territory where the Indians would exist in a state of virtual slavery. And then, quoting Galbraith, the power of the government must be brought to bear upon them. They must be whipped, coerced into obedience. After this is accomplished, few will be left to put upon a reservation. Many will be killed, more must perish from famine and exposure, and the more desperate will flee and seek refuge on the plains or in the mountains. A very small reservation should suffice for them. And he actually gets exactly what he wanted. The 1,600 people assembled below Fort Snelling are sent to a place called Crow Creek out in Dakota Territory. And it is essentially a wasteland. Once they arrive, they find that they've been sent to a flat, barren desert, almost, of, beaten down in the sun, craggy rocks and horrible soil, and no food to be seen other than the really ridiculously priced foods of the Indian agents who have arrived ahead of time in order to profit off of the people arriving. Gary Anderson calls Crow Creek a death camp. Mary Wingerd calls it a concentration camp. Crow Creek is also a horrific scandal nationwide and well acknowledged as a traumatic genocidal moment in this history. She calls it a drought-stricken wasteland, is how she describes it, and the miseries encountered by the people there are strong enough that uh, eventually Crow Creek Reservation is extinguished and they're removed to the Santee Reservation in Nebraska, where they, beyond all odds, manage to preserve as much of their culture and heritage as they can and survive the traumas of Crow Creek and Fort Snelling
Right.
and the reservation along the Minnesota River.
And the Dakotas weren't the only group that were attempted to live at Crow Creek. The Winnebagos also were initially sent to Crow Creek once they were um, eventually rounded up and moved off of their Minnesota land. Um, but they eventually also started relocating to Nebraska unofficially, and then officially in 1865 they were granted a reservation there. Um, the Ojibwe were also left in the lurch of the U.S. Dakota War.
Right.
Obviously, they were not involved in the fighting at all, but that didn't mean that the people of Minnesota didn't want them gone, and specifically the money makers wanted their timber, the timber that was on the land, and the Ojibways, resisted as much as they could. Again, the areas in northern Minnesota were less populated than southern Minnesota, so they did have some advantages there. But eventually Wingerd writes, in a series of treaties signed between 1863 and 1867, the various Ojibwe bands reluctantly agreed to exchange their remaining lands for concentrated reservations at Red Lake, Leech Lake, White Earth, Net Lake, Grand Portage, and Fond du Lac, on land that held no attraction for white settlers or speculators. Only 700 members of the Mille Lacs band somehow tenaciously held on to their traditional territory. However, timber poachers and squatters encroached on their lands almost at will. Legal authorities took no notice, and the Indians themselves did not dare act against the trespassers, hamstrung by a treaty provision that threatened removal if they should in any way interfere with or in any manner molest the persons or properties of the whites. And there were Dakota, too, who attempted to stay. There were the peaceful Dakota, sometimes called the Farmer Indians, that for some time, with the help of Bishop Henry Whipple and Alexander Faribault, had essentially a refugee camp in the city of Faribault. You mentioned Teope earlier. He saved about 200 white captives during the war. But eventually they were pushed out. The people of Faribault did not accept that. They did not want them living in the town. And eventually all of the Dakota who for a time did have a home were pushed out of Faribault. And even Alexander Faribault himself, he lost almost his entire life savings in helping the Dakota. And he actually left Faribault for a time as well. So we come to this point where centuries of coexistence and further along than we can know, of generations of people that have lived on this land, who have called this land their home, who have been kin with the place we now call Minnesota, have been diminished in a way that is difficult to comprehend. It's difficult to wrap our heads around this change. And another, a man who knew this better than anybody was Little Crow, Tayataduta, who himself understood the gravity of the change, understood the weight of generations and generations. He understood the weight of the eternity that was coming to an end, really, with that sort of last stand. And that's not to say, indigenous people live in Minnesota. Ojibwe, Winnebago, Dakota. Indigenous people live in Minnesota. It is still their home. It is still their homeland. But a genocide did take place here, and it wasn't and it took place enthusiastically here. And we can wrap up today by talking about Little Crow's final days in Minnesota and sort of what his band was doing post 1862.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to do it. After fleeing Minnesota, they had been Little Crow and the dwindling numbers of his followers actually reached out to Lakota relatives, asking them to continue the war. Turned around at each step. Eventually, they found their way to Canada, asking the British, who had been their allies in the War of 1812, whether they would provide funds to continue the conflict. And they returned back there as well. In June of 1863, he and maybe 100 other people, certainly less than that, by the end of June, decided to head back into Minnesota. And Mary Lethert Wingerd makes it pretty clear how he was feeling. She writes, "Surrender certainly was not an option. He had once pledged that no white man would touch him while he was alive. Now, he may have intended that his life should end on his terms, not as a condemned convict or a refugee fleeing from the soldiers, but unbowed in the land of his fathers. It is unlikely that he had any expectation of returning from Minnesota alive. Declaring calmly that he was a dead man, Little Crow began his journey home. And he and his son, Wawanape, spent the day of July 3rd on a raspberry farm near Hutchinson, behind the big woods, by themselves. As Wingerd writes, the sweet, juicy taste of the berries must have elicited memories of happier days as it assuaged their hunger. It was a beautiful evening. Suddenly, a shot rang out, and Little Crow, after a brief exchange of fire, fell, mortally wounded." End quote. A farmer and his son had come across Tauyataduta and Wawanape, and on sight fired at the Dakota people, and Little Crow died. Wawanape put new moccasins on Tauyataduta's feet, folded his arms, and wrapped him up in a blanket, as Wingerd writes, and he runs. Wawanape runs west towards the rest of the Dakota people, the Lakota and the Nakota, and eventually he is captured by Henry Sibley's expeditions west, and he's sent to the Santee Reservation in Nebraska. Little Crow dies on that night, on July 3rd, in that berry field in Minnesota.
And you mentioned Sibley's expedition, and Wingerd doesn't go into detail here, but these expeditions resulted in the mass death of innocent Dakota. And Wingerd writes, the Dakota War had come full circle, it seems, beginning and ending with the deaths of innocents. Logan and I will be back next week to talk about the epilogue, so we will leave it with Wingerd's ending to this chapter. All trace of the multicultural world of the upper Mississippi had vanished, along with any visible Indian presence. With prospects ahead unlimited, Minnesotans resolutely put their shoulders to the wheel of progress. If they looked back at all, it was only to fashion a selective memory that shone with benevolence on their brave new world.